Good day everyone, I'm Nina Marie C. Vinalay from BSN2B and my topic is all about to young adult literature. So first, let's start to the introduction to young adults. Defining young adult literature, articulating a brief yet comprehensive definition of young adult literature is indeed a challenging task because this definition has changed and evolved over the years. In fact, there is really no consensus among publishers, librarians, teachers, reviewers, and booksellers about what exactly or what young adult literature is. By Aronson 2002, there is not even agreement about who is a young adult. Next, young adult literature is generally described as books written for an audience of 12 to 20 years old. It may also include books primarily written for adults but which have appeal to younger readers. What is the difference between young adult and adult literature? One idea is in young adult, characters are discovering and publishing boundaries to discover themselves, while in adult literature, characters tend to be constrained by those limits and are living within them. So let's move on to how it all started. Young adult literature is relatively new. So here we are. The modern idea of a teenager didn't came around until after World War II due to various advancements. Next, up to that point, there was no literature designated for those in between children's literature and adult fiction because teenagers are now a viable demographic. Clothing companies, music, food, and technology groups are now creating items specifically for teens, including the book industry. Next, the 1950s in particular became a time Americans began seeking more leisure time or activities. Next, let's move on to the brief history of young adults books. We pretty much read, eat, and sleep all things young adult books, but where did it come from? What's the actual definition? So let's us break down everything you need to know about how young adult came about. Once upon a time, there was only adult books, and that sucked. But then, in the 1940s and 50s, Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys helped pave the way for modern young adult which began to blossom in the 1960s. We put together this quick video to highlight young adult literature throughout the decades that help explain how young adult literature has evolved to the massive pop culture phenomenon it is today. We have here the beginning. Many of the books that we now consider to be young adult texts were initially written for adults and only later categorized as young adult. One of the first books to be written and published for young adults was The Outsiders, and it still remains the quintessential young adult books today. Next, in the 1970s, young adult literature blossomed in the 1970s, moving away from the traditional children's stories of previous years in what is called the golden age of young adult literature. Authors publish more realistic and controversial titles. Novels published in these decades introduce hard-hitting topics such as death, sex, underage drinking, homelessness, and drug use. Notable young adult books of the 1970s, we have here The Crystal Cave by Mary Stewart by 1970, Go as Alice by Beatrice Sparks, 1971, Heads You Win, Tales I Lost by Isabel Holland, 1973, The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier, 1974, Forever by Judy Blume, 1975, I Know What You Did Last Summer by Louise Duncan, 1975, Gentle Hands by M.E. Kerr, 1978, Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrew, 1979. In 1980s, young adult literature continued to grow in the 1980s as more authors began writing for teenagers. The Sweet Valley High series became the first young adult book to reach the New York Times paperback bestseller list. Some authors began experimenting with style and genre, giving variety of young adults. Notable young adult books of the 1980s are Jacob Have I Love by Catherine Patterson by 1980, Fallen Angels by Walter Dean Myers by 1983, Sweet Valley High by Francine Pascal 1983, The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley 1984, The Babysitter's Club by Anne M. Martin 1986, Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones 1986, With Sibat by Francesca Leah Black 1989. So let's move on to the 1990s. The horror genre persisted in the 1990s as the Goosebumps series became immensely popular. But the early 1990s was also a darker time for young adult literature, as less young adult novels were being published. Many feared the extinction of the genre. But a rise in youth culture in late 1990s helped young adult literature swing back into favor. Notable young adult books of the 1990s are The Face of the Milk cartoon by Caroline B. Coney 1990, The Vampire Diaries, The Awakening by L.J. Smith 1991, Goosebumps by R.L. Stine 1992, The Giver by Louise Lowry 1993, Sabriel by Garth Nix 1995, Someone Like You by Sarah Dessen 1998, The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky 1999, Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson 1999. So let's move on to the year 2000s. In the early 2000s, different book awards by Prince Award, Edward Awards, Alex Awards were created specifically to honor young adult literature. At the same time, Twilight and the Hunger Games popularized paranormal and dystopian series that reigned supreme in the mid to late 2000s. This is known as the second golden age of young adults. Also, yes, Harry Potter really helped usher in a wave of new young adult books in the early 2000s. But we didn't include it in this because technically it is published for middle graders, not teens. But that's super technical and we totally bow down to Queen Rowling. So let's move on. Notable young adult books of the 2000s are The Princess Diaries by Meg Cabot by 2000, Feed by M.T. Anderson by 2002, The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak 2005, Twilight by Stephanie Meyer 2005, Looking for Alaska by John Green 2005, and American Born Chinese by Jin Luen Yang 2006. The Absolutely True Diary of the Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie 2007. The Hunger Games by Susan Collins 2008. Next, let's proceed to now. Now we have a new young adult books and series being published across all genres. They tackle all types of issues and explore numerous new worlds. That's all. Again, I'm Nina Marie C. Binalay from BSN2B. Thank you for lending your time to watch and listen in my video report.